Hey folks, I'm back with round 7 from the 2021 National Open from Las Vegas, Nevada. In this round, I was playing against Grandmaster Titas Stremavicius, who's a pretty strong player, I believe originally from Lithuania, but has been living in the US for a couple of years now as a college student. Um, and yeah, this was a real interesting game. In fact, this might be the game that I'm most proud of in the tournament in the way I handled the endgame. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about why that was exactly. But first off, let's go through the opening. So he played c4, which I believe is his main move as white. And as a King's Indian player, I generally like to start with g6 here, because I think this gives black more options where in some cases this knight can be developed to e7. But against a g6, what I noticed is that he typically goes in for the King's Indian anyway, and so after a couple of moves, we essentially just transpose to the regular King's Indian. Now, before the game, I was preparing, and I saw that he played a few different systems, mainly bishop d3 and knight g2, as well as like knight f3 and bishop e3. But for this game, he goes bishop e2, which I don't think I had seen him play before. So here I castle, and now white can actually do a number of different things here. Knight f3 would transpose into like the main classical lines. Bishop g5 is the Averbach variation, and there's also the move that he plays in the game, which is bishop e3. And generally the point of this move order, it looks very much like a Gligorich system with knight f3, is to actually keep the knight on g1 so that white can push quick g4. So it's quite a aggressive system actually, because white just wants to push g4, h4, h5 and attack on the king side, and maybe one day castle queen side and basically just go for the throat. So I play the move I typically play in these positions, which is knight a6, and my idea behind this one is to keep the center flexible. I'm not a big believer in playing e5 in this kind of position, because after d5 the position gets blocked off and the bishop on g7 is closed. And then I feel like it makes a lot of sense for white to just castle queenside and again just start attacking with g4, h4, h5. And I've always found these positions to be quite difficult for black. So I decided to keep it flexible with knight a6. And here he started thinking a little bit already, which made me feel like maybe this wasn't the move he was expecting, or he wasn't sure what to do here. I'm not really sure. Sometimes players just think in the opening because they don't want to give away how much they've actually prepared. But after some thought, he ends up playing g4 anyway. Now I played c5. This is the idea behind knight a6, to strike in the center this way. And the point is that after white plays d5, we get kind of a Benoni structure, but white is already committed to g4, which is a very extending move. And if white wants to castle queenside in this position, it's going to be really dangerous with the bishop open on the diagonal, and then black can just play for like knight c7, b5, just sacrifice the pawn, open the queenside, and get a fantastic counterplay. So generally, I'm pretty comfortable in this position, and I have some prep here that maybe I won't reveal right now. But what happened in the game was he actually, again, thinks for a little bit and plays the move g5. And when you play this one, I had remembered thinking that this move was not possible. And at the board, I just kind of double checked my analysis, but ultimately I didn't really see anything wrong. And I ended up playing this move knight to g4, which is more or less kind of the refutation to white's idea. The point is that I'm hitting the bishop on e3. This bishop has to defend the d4 pawn, so he can't go like bishop f4 or something. I'm just going to take. He definitely doesn't want to let black take on e3 because the dark squares will be really, really weak for white. And after bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4. If white takes on g4 a second time, which happens in the game, then I get c takes d4. And so black wins the piece back, and we get this position basically by force, where material is completely equal, but because we've traded off a couple of minor pieces, white's kingside advance is now actually pretty questionable, because the position has opened up, and the structure essentially resembles a Marazzi bind from the Accelerated Dragon. And in the Accelerated Dragon, or in the Marazzi bind, generally it's black that's the one that wants to trade minor pieces, because white is the one with the space advantage, black is fighting against the space, but as more and more minor pieces come off, white is just left with a lot of weak squares in the position, and the attack on the king side is just extremely slow. So this position already, I think, much better for black. White did have the option back here to not take on g4 and play something like f3, But the issue is that now I get to keep the light square bishop, which is unopposed and a very strong piece. So for example, I could play bishop to d7 here, and I think it's just a great position for black. I'll prepare b5 counterplay on the queen side, and again, white's king side play is very, very slow. If white ever goes d5, I can play e6 here and just open things up for the two bishops, and of course white's king is still kind of behind in development. So I think he probably chose the best practical chance. And I should mention, after knight g4, he really started thinking, you know, for real. So I felt pretty confident that he simply just like overlooked this idea, hadn't prepped the line or the specific move order, and I felt like I kind of caught him in the opening. So I was feeling very ambitious. In fact, I was already thinking like, you know, if he offers me a draw or something, no dice. we're playing this on, because I felt like black has a fantastic position here. So he goes knight ge2. And I drop back bishop to g7. As it turns out, black could also just take on c3 and claim a very simple advantage, again, based on just having way fewer weaknesses than white. And after something like rook c8, b3, and queen a5, I think black just gets a lot of counterplay very quickly. I can play for the b5 break soon. And yeah, basically just fighting against white structure. So this was already quite doable, but I think bishop g7 is fine. White played rook c1. I played knight c5, which I think is okay. I was also considering this move queen c8 here, hitting the queen and the c-pawn, kind of forcing white to go in for this endgame. And I think black is better here, but I wasn't really sure if I want to just force the endgame right away, as it felt like, okay, he's going to castle kingside, his king is going to have weaknesses, and so it makes sense for me to keep the queens on the board, so one day I can maybe put some pressure there. So rook c1, I decide to go knight c5. There's a little bit of a trap here if white castles. Then I have this move knight d3, hitting the rook and the pawn, rook c2, let's say, and then knight e5 forks the queen and the c4 pawn, and then I can just take this one safely, and yeah, winning a clean pawn, still very good position, and probably close to winning at this point for black. So knight c5, he goes queen to g3, and here is where, you know, basically I start to misplay things, because I simply just didn't understand how to handle the position. I don't have a lot of experience playing like the accelerated dragon or this kind of structure, so I was definitely kind of just winging it and on my own here. And I just tried to make natural moves, but it definitely lets him completely back in the game. So I played rook c8. I think better was to start with queen to d7, of course just kind of developing the queen. And the idea that I didn't really consider at all, to be honest, was that after castles, black can play this break with f5. And seeing it now, it makes perfect sense. I'm just trying to open up the f-file and try to exploit some of white's weaknesses. If the diagonal opens up, you know, the queen can be really strong on the light squares. And whatever way white takes, like ef5, rook takes f5, or gf6, rook takes f6, black structure ends up healthier anyway. The second rook can come to f8. And knight d5 is kind of an annoying tempo. But okay, the rook can drop back, and of course white will have to defend e4 at some point, and black can always play e6 to chase this knight away. And so definitely not a big deal to allow this knight on d5. So I think that was kind of the strongest way to play it, but yeah, I just simply didn't realize the power of this pawn break. I decided just to make natural moves, so I go rook c8, castles, a6, covering the b5 square, but also giving me the chance to play b5 in the future, if I like, and again, just trying to create counterplay on the queen side. Rook fd1 was played. Now I play knight d7. I think it's a reasonable move. My point is that I'm just hitting the pawn and getting ready to transfer my knight to e5. So white plays b3. Now I play h6. This is kind of my follow-up that I was intending. I don't think white should take on h6 because then his pawns get isolated, and yeah, black structure is clearly very good. So he played h4, which I was kind of expecting, and now my idea is to play h5. And the reason I kind of induced him to play h4 was because if I just played h5 immediately, of course he's not going to take en passant. This gives him the chance to keep the pawn on h2, and then he can play h3 one day. So where this is important is after h6, h4, and h5, now when my knight gets to e5, he can't really kick it with f4 so easily because then I'll get the g4 square. So this is kind of like, forget if there's an official term for this, but it's like a pseudo outpost, because the knight on e5 is very strong, and the only way white can kick it is by giving me a second or different outpost on g4. Whereas of course if the pawn is on h2, then on knight e5 he can first play h3, cover the g4 square, and then prepare f4, and eventually I would have to go back. So here he goes knight d5. And yeah, once again, my inexperience in these positions kind of shows, because one of the main moves, I was considering pretty much every turn for the next couple moves was this move e6, which is a typical move to play because you want to take away the d5 square from white's pieces. This knight on d5 is, of course, very, very strong. But the obvious drawback to this one is that the d6 pawn ends up hanging. So after knight e3, like not totally sure exactly how I'm going to deal with this weakness. Like I could play knight e5, for example, but then it kind of runs into c5, and it wasn't clear to me what I'm doing here. And bishop e5 just runs into f4, and then the d6 pawn kind of hangs. So the engine, of course, doesn't care and points out queen a5, very, very strong move. And the idea is that actually black has enough play to sacrifice this pawn in almost any position. So, for example, let's say white plays queen takes d6. Black's idea could be like knight e5, threatening knight f3 check, as well as moves like rook d8 and just going after the d file. The knight can also come into d3. So one sample line is like king g2. Let's say this rook to d8. Queen has to go to like e7. And now knight d3 is very annoying for white, because if rook c2, I have this funny move knight e1 check. I mean, very easy for the engine to spot. For a human, it really takes some careful calculation. But long story short, black has just plenty of compensation for the pawn and is just going to be winning back the material soon. I can take on a2 soon, and then knight will be hanging, pawn will be hanging, and basically white's position is close to collapsing. So I don't think he would actually end up taking this pawn. He would probably go something like rook to c2. But then I can continue like knight c5, hitting the e-pawn, let's say f3, and then rook fd8. And still, white can't really get away with taking on d6. Here the engine points out knight d3 is very strong, just opening up all kinds of tactics on the diagonal and possible queen e1 check and things like this. But even if I just trade rooks and go rook d8, yeah, black just gets huge counterplay on the d file, and so this would be more than enough for the pawn. So it's really interesting for me to analyze these lines, and I think that this is one of the most like important moments of the game to analyze. It's like when you know there's a move you kind of want to make and you feel like the position is calling for it, but tactically you feel kind of suspicious of it. Of course, strategically, yeah, weakening the pawn. But yeah, really interesting to kind of learn from these moments. Next time, of course, you can find the right idea in a similar position. Because I ended up playing rook to e8, which I don't think is a terrible move, but it's clearly not as good as e6 because I'm just letting this knight kind of dominate my position. Here white plays knight c3, I play knight e5, king g2, and yeah, again, in all these positions, the engine is just calling for e6 and says that black should just play this one and just activate after kicking the knight away. But I decided to instead play queen a5. My idea behind this one was that I was actually thinking white might be interested in playing like knight a4, knight b6, and getting some kind of clamp. And so I wanted to be ready to play something like b5. So on knight b6, for example, I have rook c6, and I think his knights are actually very awkward. Of course, the queen side is under heavy fire, and I basically just don't think this is working for white. What I missed with this move, because I was kind of expecting, I was calculating this move b4, which seems like a very sharp move. Originally, my idea was to play queen a3, which looked fishy at first, right? Because the queen is kind of in white's camp, and of course I'm very worried about getting it trapped. But I didn't actually see how white does it because the c4 pawn is hanging. And so I felt like this is just giving me huge counterplay. Of course, the knight is pinned, so he can't really do any like knight b1 or anything like that. And like, yeah, I mean, a2 pawn is hanging, c4 pawn is hanging. I mean, it's hanging if the knight moves away. And so at first I just didn't see what he can do. Then while he was thinking on his move, I realized, well, b4, queen a3, actually he just goes rook b1 here. And the next move, rook b3, and my queen is trapped, and there's nothing I can do. I can take on c4 two different ways, but rook b3 just traps the queen anyway, and basically I have no way of getting out. So on b4, I would have to go back to plan B, which is just to retreat with queen d8. And I wasn't too upset about this one because I felt like, well, I did get him to extend another pawn, and now the c4 pawn is weak. He can play c5, I was thinking, with idea like dc, knight f6 check, and wins the queen, and position gets, not sure if black is like lost, but position definitely gets kind of messy. But instead I was just going to play like rook c6 here, just defend the pawn, and I thought that black is actually still okay, and again, white has extended quite a bit, so the structure might be kind of weak. As it happened, he ends up playing queen e3, and here I felt like his idea is either queen b6, or queen a7. I actually wasn't sure, but I felt like, okay, he wants to kind of infiltrate. And I thought about a couple of things here. For instance, first I considered like rook c6. I thought this was a very reasonable move. I wasn't totally sure what I'm doing on queen a7 though. But again, the engine just points out e6. Let's say knight goes back, rook c8, and actually he can't take this pawn because queen just gets trapped with rook to c7. So I mean he has like b4, but it's not really working. I get like queen a3, and yeah, essentially white's position, or I mean queen is just getting trapped. So rook c6 was definitely playable, and I'm not sure what he would have done on this one. I doubt he would have came in with queen a7, but basically black's position is quite okay here. But I ended up playing queen c5, and my feeling with this one was that I thought the endgame was actually quite reasonable for black, which turns out to be totally wrong. My idea was that if queen takes c5, I want to take with the pawn, and then reroute this knight to c6 and d4, and use this outpost, and eventually just kick white's knight with e6, now that I don't have to worry about this d6 pawn. So this is where I think the decision kind of came from. I was just so relieved not to have to worry about my d6 pawn being weak that I get to play e6 and I get this like superb outpost on d4, and it looked pretty good. But then once we got to the endgame, he started thinking, and I realized, wait, actually, like when he goes f4 here, for example, which he ends up playing, if I play knight c6, I mean, he can just bury my bishop with e5. And I simply didn't realize the strategic danger here until, you know, we got to the endgame. So sure, I get like a nice knight on d4, but my bishop is completely stuck. And if I ever play like e6 here, let's say e6 in this position, if he wants to, he doesn't have to, but if he wants, he can go knight f6, force me to take, he takes back, and then he gets a much better outpost on d6 than I do on d4. And yeah, from up close, this position just looked horrible to me. You know, knight e4 is coming, c5 pawn will be hanging, and then knight d6 is just such a powerful piece there. Maybe even sacks the exchange somewhere, and it's just completely dominating. So after he played f4, you know, I realized I've kind of messed this up, and now I might be in danger of being seriously worse. And this is where I actually, like, you know, I start kicking myself a little bit because I knew my position was just so good out of the opening, but I also realized, like, you know, maybe it's not like lost yet, right? Like, I should definitely still have chances, and I do try to fight pretty hard in order to get back in it. And I end up finding a series of only moves just to stay in the game, which I was really happy about. So I start with knight g4. I figured, okay, the knight doesn't really want to go to c6 and d4. What I need to do is deal with white's strategic threat of e5. And for the moment, he can't really play e5 because then I will play e6, and his knight is kicked away from defending the square. So knight f6, for example, I just take it, and then I win the exchange. And I felt like, okay, white probably has some decent compensation here, but you know, compared to some of the other positions I could get, if I'm up in exchange, I mean, that's an absolute dream. Maybe he has compensation, maybe he's even better, but clearly this is the best case scenario so far. So he ends up going king f3, which I meanly expected, and it's just a simple move, just covers knight e3 and prepares to go e5 next. And now I felt like, okay, well, I have to go bishop d4. If my bishop gets buried with e5, it just looked strategically terrible. You know, second knight comes to e4, and my knight on g4 also doesn't look very good. Like, without the queens on the board, it's not clear what the knight on g4 is really doing. White's king is perfectly safe. So I play bishop d4. And in case of something like knight e2, my idea was to play e6 here, and kicking the knight from d5. Now he can't really play knight f6 check because I have too many on it. If he takes on d4, I'll take on d5, and this is hanging and this is hanging. And if he plays knight b6, I can go rook to d8. I defend the bishop, and if he trades this one, either I trade rooks or I just take with the pawn immediately. But now my knight gets a really nice square on e3. And if white plays like e5, for example, then I get knight e3 and knight to f5. And this one I thought was fine for black because then the knight can kind of put pressure on this h4 pawn. And I'm covering the d6 square, and I have this d pawn. I thought I'm getting at least reasonable counterplay. So as it happens, I think he plays the most critical move, which is e5. And now he just wants to, again, bring the knight to e4 and just start improving his position and really squeezing. And here I decided to play f6. I mean, it's kind of like an intuitive decision, but I felt like I really just have to fight back as quickly as possible, and I have to make this pawn break and try to open some lines and get some counterplay against white's king. If I let him just set up this like iron grip with knight e4, I just felt like I was never gonna break out. So this is just the first and maybe only chance to do this move. So now I realized on his turn, again, that he actually has kind of a strong option here that I really didn't anticipate. And that is he can go gf6, ef6, and knight e4. And it's very important to go gf6 for him, because if he takes this way, so this is what I was kind of expecting. I saw that he couldn't really do it in this move order, because I just take on e4. King takes e4, knight f2 check, and then I win back the rook. So let's say king f3 takes, he can take on f6 with check. I'm realizing actually now he can also go knight e7, which I totally missed during the game. Or maybe I saw this one, but maybe I had something else in mind here. Huh. Honestly, I'm not really sure. I guess I can throw in rook e8, but yeah, it doesn't quite look as clear. I definitely had something in mind here, but now I'm just not remembering what it is, so I apologize. But as it happens, he goes gf6, which I think is stronger, because takes knight e4, I don't even have this option with rook takes e4. And now this one is hanging, knight d6 is hanging as well, and I basically have a big choice to make. But it seems like I actually have to sacrifice the exchange one way or another, because if I let him take on f6 twice, then that's just going to be devastating. And so I was thinking about fe5 here, knight d6, and my main thought was to go e4 check, let's say king e2, but then I'm losing the exchange. So for example, rook d8 takes, and I actually didn't see exactly how I'm going to get real counterplay here, because the e-pawn is just very much blockaded, and the king is sitting at a very safe distance from this knight on g4. Like, I don't really have any nice maneuvers with the knight to target the king. If I can bring it to d4, that'd be great, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So I wasn't really sure about this one. The engine points out, actually, instead of pushing e4, black should just play like rook d8 and sacrifice the exchange, but without committing to this one. So then maybe black can put some more pressure on the f-file, like rook f8, for example, and here if white takes, then I can take with the knight, and that actually is kind of annoying for white, and I think black has some reasonable compensation there. But I think I end up making the right choice, because I end up playing this move rook to c6. And now my point is I'm sacrificing the exchange on f6, and after he takes twice, he has other options, but they don't really work out, like knight d6, for example. Black can go rook e6, and he can take on b7, threatening rook d8. I wasn't really sure what's happening during the game. I think I might have taken here. I threatened knight d8, excuse me. But the engine points out black can just go back rook c8. And if knight d6, something like rook f8, and basically, okay, we sacrificed the pawn, but we do have a lot of counterplay on the f-file. Something like takes, and if knight takes, we can maybe take with the bishop, or even throw in this one, or take like this, and yeah, f4 pawn is going to be kind of weak. So he doesn't really have, I think, a huge choice, and he ends up taking on f6. I take, knight takes f6, and now rook takes f6. This is my idea, ef6, and I come in with rook e3 check. So king g2, I continue giving checks, because white doesn't really have such a comfortable way of getting out. So of course, if he goes to the third rank, it's just rook e3, and there's no progress there, and he can't use the f2 square, so my rook on the second rank is also safe. And I was thinking if he goes king f1, then I would throw in this check, force his king to e1, and then maybe take on a2 in this position. Now that his king is basically like blocking his rooks, and his rooks have a very hard time getting into the game. And so I'm down the exchange, no pawn, but I am threatening king f7, and I'm going to pick up this one. These two pawns are super weak. White has no clear way of making a pass pawn. I actually felt like black has full compensation here. Not necessarily more than that, but perhaps if white over pushes, then things could actually go really wrong for white. Like if I'm able to pick up the h4 pawn, or like my king gets in f5 g4, anchored bishop in the center of the board is often a very, very strong piece, and hardly worse than the rook, just because it's controlling so many squares, blocking files, and really doing a lot of work. So we actually repeat here a couple of times. King f3, rook e3 check, king g2, rook e2, which is very smart on his end, because we're both kind of in time trouble. I think he might have a little bit less time than me. And this is now move 34. And basically his idea is to shuffle the king, and he doesn't repeat the position more than twice on any of these moves. And finally on move 39, he goes king h1. And the point of this, and the reason why they say, always repeat, it's like part of the, Soviet chess philosophy, is that, well, now he's gotten a lot closer to the time control. He only has to make one more move. Then he gets an extra 30 minutes, and then he can use that time to really try to figure out how to grind the endgame. And honestly, until he played king h1, I really wasn't sure if he was going to push this one for the win. I mean, I don't think white has any losing chances whatsoever, and that's probably why he decided to play this one. But to me, it did look like black has full compensation, and a lesser player, like someone like me, I could easily see myself misplaying this as white and then end up losing because black, wins too many pawns, and then the bishop is just super strong. So I really wasn't sure, but credit to him for continuing to fight. He goes king h1. And now he doesn't have to make a ton of difficult decisions before the time trouble. Basically, he just has to make one more move, and then he gets extra time to kind of think about how to convert things. So here I went in for a big think because I have two main options here. I can either take the pawn on a2 immediately, or I can activate the king with king f7. I really wasn't sure which one is better, but I thought if I take on a2, for example, then he can come in with like rook e1, let's say king f7, give this check, take, and take here. And I really wasn't sure what's happening here. Of course, I do have king f5, and with kind of a nasty threat, king g4, king h3, rook h2 mate. But I felt like, white is in time to kind of defend against this one. Like, he can put the rook on d1 and play rook to d3. And in the meantime, if my king gets too far, his rook will pick up this pawn. I wasn't totally sure if I have enough here. I thought it should be okay. The engine points out that rook f1 is actually a much stronger move, with the idea of king f7 to just push f5 and just open up lines for the rook. And in general, this is kind of good strategy. When you're playing up the exchange, you do want to kind of open things up for your rooks, but without trading too many pawns. Of course, you want to keep some pawns on the board to retain your winning chances. And yeah, ultimately I end up just going king f7 because I felt like, it's in the endgame, the king needs to activate. This is definitely a move I want to make. And white's a pawn doesn't really scare me, right? Like if he spends a tempo pushing a4, it's not super scary. I can play a5 here to fix the pawn on b3. I can maybe just take here on f6 and again just start bringing in my king. And I felt like this would be a big tempo for him to spend, just saving this pawn. Instead he plays b4, which I think is definitely the best try. I take on f6, he takes on c5, bishop takes c5. Now he goes rook to d5, which I think, again, the best move, just cutting the king off and preventing me from activating, and forcing me to go b6. And yeah, during the game, I was still feeling optimistic about this position. I didn't think I'm losing it, mainly because, again, the bishop is anchored, which is a very important thing, that it's not just hanging in every position. It's basically impossible for white to create a pass pawn, given the structure. It's just nothing white can really do. And again, all of white's pawns are weak, and they're all isolated. In particular, these kingside pawns are really, really big targets because I have like rook e4 in every position. Of course, a2 pawn is hanging here. And again, I feel like I have good chances. So here he goes a4. And now again, I have a pretty significant choice. I can either push a5, of course, preventing white from doing this and undermining my bishop, or I can go rook a2 and actually just try to win the pawn immediately. And I really wasn't sure what to play here because, rook a2 feels very tempting. If I can take this pawn and then my a-pawn starts running, like I mentioned in previous videos, like often the best form of defense is a counterattack, right? So if I can get counterplay with this a-pawn, then white's rooks have to deal with it, and he doesn't have time to create his own counterplay. But ultimately, I really wasn't sure about it. For example, white plays something like f5, takes, rook f1, and then he wants to take here with check, maybe take this pawn. And I didn't really want to get a position where we're racing. I felt like if we get some kind of pawn race where he has h-pawn, I have a-pawn, I just thought like the two rooks are going to be stronger there. He also has lots of checks and maybe can think about, for example, he takes here, he puts this rook on g5, then he goes rook h6 check and starts hunting my king, right? And if my king ever ends up on the back rank, there's going to be a lot of mating ideas there, and it ultimately just felt very dangerous. So after some thought, I ended up just playing a5. I just kind of, I believe in my position. I just try to hold the structure and I keep the rook active. He plays f5, which I think is basically his only pawn break. And now rook e4, another accurate move. Just threatening to take this one with check. If I can take this pawn, then I felt like, okay, white doesn't have this winning plan of just getting a passed h-pawn, and I felt like that was kind of important. And from white's point of view, there's nothing he can really do to stop this, so he kind of continues playing the critical moves. Fg, I take here, king g2, give this, I just take first. Actually, I could have played rook g4, but I thought it was unnecessary, so I take on g6. And now he goes rook c3. And so this is where things really start getting kind of difficult for me, because if I give this check now, he'll play rook g3. And my feeling was if I trade rooks here, I'm probably just lost. I mean, the bishop is very solid here, but the point is, like, I'm going to lose the pawn at some point. And once I lose the pawn, you know, it's like I just have no counterplay. The rook on d5 is untouchable, and white will slowly prepare, like bringing in his king. Rook will shuffle, king can come in. And yeah, eventually I just felt like it's going to be lost. You know, my king gets pushed back, king comes into c6, and then one day he takes on b6 with the rook and just has like an extra pawn. So definitely like a really, really difficult position. I mean, you can try like king h6, you know, king h4, bishop f2 check. White doesn't make progress, but I think he just comes up this way. And you know, if I push this pawn, you know, king g4, bishop f2, rook d6, for example, you know, white just like keeps making continual progress, and just felt very, very suspicious. I don't think I'm really, because the bishop just has to stay here to hold both pawns, right? It makes it very ripe for some kind of zugzwang. So of course my feeling was that I just cannot trade rooks given the current situation. So I play king f6. He goes king g3, rook h1. And now my idea is to, again, just maybe play rook a1 to go after this one, maybe rook c1 if his rook leaves c3. And basically I'm just trying to keep my rook active and try to create counterplay. Maybe I'll even push h4 if his king kind of wanders too far away. So here he goes rook f3 check, king g6. And I actually was feeling pretty good here, because I was thinking even if he goes like rook f5, for example, I can definitely consider going h4 check. I was also thinking about, let's say, going here, king f3, and playing this one. And now the point is that I'm just taking on c4, so let's say rook takes h5, rook takes c4. And I actually didn't see how his rooks do anything to me here, right? He can give rook g5 check, but then just king f6. And if he goes back to d5, I'll just go back king g6. And if he's not able to push the king back, basically he doesn't really have any threats. At some point, white has to just think about making a draw, because I'm just taking the pawn on a4. And yeah, I mean, if my king is able to shuffle over to the queen side and I start pushing the a-pawn, I mean, then only black can really play for the win, right? So it's like, I felt like, well, if I get this, I'll be very happy. So then he really shocks me with this move king f4, which somehow I just completely overlooked. I just didn't even think it was possible. But the move itself, I think, is very strong. At least it puts black in a very difficult situation. Because now he is threatening things like rook g3 check, and his king is getting in, so he wants rook g3, king f6, rook f5 check, king e6, rook g6, and my king is suddenly forced to be pushed back. He has his king involved in the attack, and king and two rooks, you know, it can be very, very dangerous. Now the drawback to this one is that it allows black to play rook h4 check. And ultimately I just closed my eyes and did this one because I felt like, well, if I'm saving this position, I have to take on c4. Because if I don't take this pawn, then whenever I trade rooks, I know it's just very likely to be lost. But once I take the pawn, I have counterplay, right? I'm threatening to take the a-pawn, and again, the a-pawn is always going to be dangerous, so white really has a very limited time. Now already at this point on rook g3 check, I had kind of made up my mind as to what I was going to do here. And that was the move rook to g4. So now that I've won this c4 pawn, I felt like I can actually hold the endgame after trading rooks. If I don't go rook g4, you know, I was thinking about king f7 here, then it just looked really, really dangerous. White gets rook d7, my king is immediately pushed back. I can try bishop e7, but okay, I'm pinned up, and yeah, it felt very, very dangerous. So let's say king to e8, and then the second rook can come in, and then this rook is going to b7, this rook is going to h7. It just looked ripe for disaster. Like, I really wasn't sure. Maybe the engine, you know, finds some defense here, I thought, but it looked very, very dangerous. My other option was to go king h6, where, you know, maybe I can try to use the h-pawn as some kind of shield. I forget exactly what move I was expecting here. I think king f5, and again, just looked super dangerous. Rook g6 is coming, rook d7, maybe just rook d7 first, followed by rook g6 mate. And yeah, just concretely, I couldn't really find a solution here. So although I wasn't totally sure about the evaluation of this one, I felt like I have to try this. The other two might just be immediately lost, but this one, there's a good chance I can actually hold the draw. So he takes. He doesn't really have any other serious tries. Again, now that I've won this c4 pawn, I can even play here and just trade off the rooks, and I'm totally fine since the bishop is just anchored, and yeah, white can't really do anything. So he trades, he goes king f4, and he does win the g-pawn, but my idea was that I thought this position should be holding. And I wasn't totally sure. I mean, it looks like, yeah, I mean, how could black lose this, right? But the problem is, you know, white's rook is very strong, and the king is going to get in, and white can kind of slowly push black's king away. Now, I can make it hard, so I go king e6, I approach the queen side, and I play king d6 here. He goes king f3, I play king c6, king e4, and I play king b7. I don't know if this was really necessary. I think it's also possible just to keep the king in the center. But basically I think the only way white can win this is if he somehow manages to force my king over to the h-file. So let's just say, just for example, you know, let's say I willingly go there myself, which would be really bad on my part. But just to kind of demonstrate how white can win this, and a lot of times these endgames kind of come down to these like very weird positions that require a lot of technique. Because of course black doesn't want to go to the other side, but sometimes the king and rook just force it over, and you know there's some zugzwang. So if I move my bishop somewhere, white can combine ideas of like attacking the bishop and pushing the king over. I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen, but it's important to understand kind of how you can lose this position. So let's say we get something like this. White cuts the king off on the g-file. Say king f7, rook to g2. Now the point is that white's king will walk over this way, and at a certain point just switch over, rook b2, rook takes b6. So let's say here, for example, let's say black is just sitting. I mean, there's nothing to do, rook b2. And now if I walk back with the king, I'm simply not in time. Here, 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 and here. And notice that black is just down by one tempo, right? If it was black to move in this position, king c8, and black makes a draw. So what that means is that the only way black loses this is if the king gets stuck on the h-file. If I get cut off on the g-file, then white's not in time, right? Let's say white like spends an extra tempo and then takes here, then black's king gets back in time and makes a draw. Now, let's say the king does get stuck on the h-file, white goes rook b2, I come here, and white takes this one. At this point, probably the best chance would be bishop to b4. And then if white again goes after the second pawn, let's say king b5 and here, then again black is in time and makes the draw. But what would happen instead on bishop b4 is that white would simply just start all over again, and again try to push the king over to the h-file. And because of the 50 move rule, it gets reset, right? After white plays rook takes b6, there's no more 50 move rule, which is usually the main thing black is relying on to kind of hold this position, is this 50 move rule. If you have 50 moves without a capture or pawn move, right, the game is agreed drawn. But after white takes on b6, the 50 move rule is reset. So bishop b4, you know, he's not going to go here and take. Instead, he's just going to try to again push my king back using the same technique. And with now my bishop having only one anchor square instead of two, probably this one is better chances for white. Okay, so that's what I kind of figured out during the game, because I've seen like similar endgames before, and that's usually kind of the technique. So that's why, okay, you know, you try to keep your king next to the pawns, but ultimately the king can't really stay there. So white goes king d5, and originally I was thinking like I would just hide here, but I really wasn't sure about this one. So for example, king c6, king a7, let's say white brings the king here, I come up this way, and then white goes here, for example. And I was really nervous about allowing this, right? Because he does have an idea. He can go rook h7 and play for rook a7 mate. Now maybe on rook h7 I have like b5, but I just wasn't totally sure, right? It's like just kind of hard to calculate from afar. And I didn't really want to, you know, hinge on just missing some resource, right? I didn't want the evaluation to hinge on whether I like see some crazy zugzwang that he has, because he doesn't have to play rook h7 right now. You know, maybe he goes here, or excuse me, in this position it's already black to move, right? So let's say the bishop goes back. You know, maybe he has some attack or some zugzwang. I just wasn't sure. I think it is drawn anyway, because like here, for example, I can still play b5, And okay, he doesn't have rook h6 check. Even if he did, I would have bishop b6, and I think I'm actually okay as long as I trade off the last pawn. That's going to be an easy draw. But during the game, I felt like, I'm not really sure, and if he wants to, the thing is he can kick my king out of the corner anyway. So for example, let's say he gives, let's say I go here, here, and I play this one, he gives this check, I play this one, and let's say he just makes a move. Or let's say rook b7 actually I think would be the most accurate. So now I have to move my bishop somewhere on this diagonal, and let's say white goes rook b8, bishop drops back, or excuse me, rook b8, I gotta go king a7, excuse me. Rook goes this way. Let's say bishop comes here, let's say white goes here, and yeah, bishop still has to keep moving. Ultimately, I felt like there was a way for him to kind of kick me out. Not really seeing it now, probably I was just seeing some ghosts during the game. Long story short, I didn't really want to risk it, given that I felt like black is also okay if I just don't go to the corner. So I decided to play king c7. And this allows him to push me to the back rank, but I don't think the back rank is that scary. Like with the bishop on c5, it's hard for him to actually checkmate me. And it's going to be hard to create a zugzwang because the bishop is usually going to have a move. And so as long as I don't touch the h-file and get my king cut off there, I felt like I should be okay. So he ends up trying for about 25 moves. I go bishop g1, rook d7, king d6, give this check, bishop e3. Now, of course, very important, I don't blunder like, bishop g1, rook g7. That would be one way of losing this position. So bishop e3, got to keep the bishop safe. Now he tries rook d1, I go back, rook d3, I go here. Rook d1, I come back, rook d7, I go bishop e3. Still no 3-time repetition, king d6, check, and now he goes king c7. So he realizes, okay, he has to try to move my king over this way. So now he starts trying like this. So he gets rook e2, and here he actually does make some progress. He gets my king off on the e-file, but of course this isn't enough. And essentially it just gets very hard for him to make any further progress. Like in this position, the bishop is just covering some key squares. There's not a lot of zugzwangs. I can play bishop b4 if I need to make sure the bishop is defended. And ultimately, he's just not able to really make a lot more progress. King f5. I just sit, rook e2, bishop c5, rook e1. I come here. And yeah, finally he, realizes there's nothing to do. He goes over to the h-file, but then my king can reapproach the center. And eventually we get here. Now I felt totally fine because basically he hasn't really made any progress for the last 20 moves or so. And we end up just playing a couple more moves. And he actually offers a draw at this point, which I thought was kind of clever because at this point I can go bishop c5 check again. And I was keeping track of my score sheet because a lot of players mess up when they don't realize the position is actually repeated 3 times. But I specifically was putting the bishop on g1. And I remember we've had this position twice before. And so bishop c5 would anyway be the 3rd repetition, but okay, he offered a draw. I accepted, and that was that. So yeah, I was actually really happy with this one. Unfortunately, I had such a big advantage from the opening. I felt like I should be playing for the win. But the endgame, after queen takes c5 was genuinely very difficult going back here. And afterwards, when I checked the game with the engine, I was surprised to find that I basically found the top line of the engine starting from f4, like knight g4, bishop d4, f6. These were basically the only moves to survive here. Rook c6, sacrificing the exchange, and then coming in with the rook, and then king f7 was again very accurate, getting the king in. King takes f6, rook d5, b6, a4. a5 was right, not going after the pawn of the rook a2. And after f5, rook e4, this was all very, very accurate. And finally, when the position got really difficult after king f4, I felt like I was actually on the verge of losing here. I realized that I can take this pawn and hold the endgame with rook g4, and that turned out to be correct. The endgame is indeed drawn. So I'm usually not good at holding these bad endgames, especially against stronger players, grandmasters, but yeah, I felt really proud that I was able to actually save it, from a very, very difficult position. So this game put me on 4.5 out of 7 with 2 rounds left to play. I'll be recording those videos shortly, and hopefully I'll see you there. Have a good one and take care.